In the early hours of June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the world stunned and aviation experts scrambling for answers. The Airbus A330 had departed from Rio de Janeiro en route to Paris, carrying 228 passengers and crew. The flight began routinely, cruising smoothly above the Atlantic under the command of an experienced crew and equipped with modern systems. But in the darkness of night and deep within a remote stretch of ocean, things took a devastating turn. As the aircraft entered a region known for volatile weather near the equator, it encountered a series of towering thunderclouds, common but dangerous features in the intertropical convergence zone. The plane's pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, began to ice over. These small but essential sensors are critical for providing accurate data to the flight computers and pilots. As they became blocked with ice, the airspeed readings turned unreliable, causing the autopilot to disconnect. In that moment, the smooth ride became a high-stakes test of skill and judgment. With the autopilot off, the co-pilot at the controls reacted by pulling the nose of the aircraft upward. This might seem instinctive, but at high altitude, such a move can lead to an aerodynamic stall, a condition where the wings lose lift and the plane begins to fall. The cockpit filled with warning tones and confusing alerts. The stall alarm sounded repeatedly, but the pilots failed to recognize the nature of the problem. The aircraft, instead of leveling out, continued to pitch upward, bleeding speed and lift. For more than 3 minutes, the jet descended in a stalled condition, falling from the sky at a terrifying rate, while the crew struggled to make sense of what was happening. Despite having time and altitude to recover, the lack of clear situational awareness, combined with insufficient training and manual high-altitude stall recovery, sealed the fate of the flight. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, the plane struck the ocean surface with tremendous force, killing all 228 people on board. The wreckage was scattered across the ocean floor, nearly 4,000 meters deep, in one of the most inaccessible regions of the Atlantic. Initial search efforts recovered only a small portion of the debris, and the flight recorders remained lost for nearly 2 years. When they were finally retrieved in 2011, the world learned the grim details of the final moments. The investigation revealed a cascade of errors. The iced pitot tubes were the initial trigger, but it was human error that ultimately caused the crash. The pilot's lack of understanding of the stall, compounded by poor coordination and communication in the cockpit, led to a series of incorrect actions. The aircraft was fully functional and could have been flown to safety, but confusion and misinterpretation of the situation led to a catastrophic outcome. In the aftermath, the aviation industry took several hard lessons to heart. Air France and other airlines revised training protocols, particularly in manual flying skills and high-altitude stall recovery. The design of pitot tubes was improved to better resist icing. Cockpit communication procedures were also reassessed to emphasize clearer roles and more assertive decision-making in emergencies. Air France Flight 447 was a sobering reminder that even the most advanced aircraft are not immune to human vulnerability. It highlighted how, in moments of crisis, technology alone cannot substitute for understanding, experience, and communication. The tragedy reshaped aviation safety, leaving behind a legacy of reforms aimed at preventing such a disaster from ever happening again. It was the early hours of October 31, 1979. The Night Owl, Western Airlines Flight 2605, cut through the darkness, gliding south from Los Angeles toward Mexico City. Aboard the massive McDonnell Douglas DC-10 were 88 people, business travelers, families, and crew members who had made the red-eye their routine. The flight left LAX at 1:40 a.m., and by the time it neared Mexico, dawn had not yet broken. Only the faintest traces of twilight hung over the city. Thick fog swallowed the ground below. Visibility was vanishing by the minute. At 5:42 a.m., the DC-10 descended into Mexico City International Airport. On paper, it was a standard approach. The controllers cleared the crew for an ILS approach using runway 23L, but here was the fatal problem. 23L wasn't open. It had been closed since October 19th for resurfacing. Trucks and construction vehicles cluttered its surface. Workers were already out there preparing for another long day. Yet the glide path, the familiar beam of the ILS system, still led straight to that runway. The crew had landed here before while 23L was shut down. They knew the procedure. Use the ILS on 23L, then sidestep visually to the parallel open runway, 23R. But Mexico's controllers never used the phrase sidestep approach, a term American pilots would immediately recognize. Instead, they told the crew 4 different times that their landing runway was 23R. The fog was dense. Twilight made the ground look unfamiliar. And still, the DC-10 stayed locked on course for the wrong strip of asphalt. Inside the cockpit, Captain Charles Gilbert, First Officer Ernst Reichel, and Flight Engineer Daniel Walsh believed they were on final for 23R. But in the last moments, realization crept in. The captain cursed. No, this is the approach to the goddamned left. A second later, the massive DC-10 smashed down, its left landing gear hitting grass and its right landing gear barely catching the shoulder of 23L. The force of impact was brutal. The plane jolted, bouncing violently. The crew pushed for a go-around. Engines roared, and the jet clawed its way back into the sky. For a fleeting instant, it seemed possible that they might recover. But disaster was already set in motion. The right landing gear tore loose, slamming into the horizontal stabilizer. The crippled jet was now bleeding metal and fire. It rolled sharply to the right. In the cockpit, panic erupted. Reichel shouted desperately, "Get it up!" while Gilbert screamed, struggling to control the wounded aircraft. In just seconds, the DC-10 clipped a dump truck, scattering earth and killing its driver. Moments later, the right wing carved into an excavator, tearing further apart. The roll became uncontrollable. The aircraft spiraled, its wingtip slicing into taxiways. Then, with horrifying force, it slammed into an Eastern Airlines maintenance building north of the runways. Concrete shattered. Fireballs erupted. The DC-10 broke apart in a deafening roar as flames engulfed the wreckage. Debris scattered across the airport and into nearby neighborhoods, where pieces of burning wing ignited houses. Rescue crews rushed to the scene, but chaos made every second impossible. Survivors crawled from a 20-foot section of fuselage that had miraculously stayed intact. They looked back to see the rest of the jet consumed in fire. Some described chunks of the shattered building collapsing onto the wreckage even as they escaped. Others remembered only the screams and the unbearable heat before silence overtook the cabin. Of the 88 souls aboard, 72 never made it out alive. One maintenance worker on the ground died instantly when the aircraft crushed his truck. Dozens more were injured, some scarred forever. Mexico City had just witnessed its deadliest aviation accident, a disaster that shocked both nations and exposed fatal cracks in communication, procedure, and decision-making. The investigation would later blame the pilots for continuing below minimums in near-zero visibility and landing on a closed runway. But pilot unions argued the instructions given were vague, confusing, and dangerously inadequate. Whatever the technicalities, one fact remained. In 26 short seconds from first touchdown to final impact, the night owl had turned into a firestorm. And the most chilling part? This was no isolated event. 1979 was a cursed year for the DC-10. In May, American Airlines Flight 191 exploded into flames at Chicago O'Hare, killing 273. 1 month later, another DC-10 suffered a deadly mishap. Then, only weeks after Flight 2605, Air New Zealand Flight 901 would vanish into Antarctica's Mount Erebus. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 left Tokyo's Haneda Airport for what was supposed to be a short and uneventful flight to Osaka. It was a routine domestic trip, something the airline had done countless times before without incident. The aircraft, a Boeing 747SR, was a specially modified version of the jumbo jet designed for short-haul, high-capacity flights within Japan. On board were 524 people, mostly families returning home, business travelers heading to meetings, and a dedicated crew guiding them through what should have been a simple journey from point A to point B. But about 12 minutes after takeoff, the ordinary became unthinkable. At 6:24 p.m., a loud bang shattered the usual hum of the engines and the relative calm of the cabin. The rear pressure bulkhead, an essential structural component that keeps the aircraft pressurized at altitude, had suddenly failed. What followed was an explosive decompression that tore through the tail of the aircraft. In an instant, the vertical stabilizer, essentially the plane's steering fin, was ripped clean off. To make matters worse, the explosion severed all 4 of the plane's hydraulic systems, the systems responsible for moving the control surfaces. In simple terms, the plane had no way to steer or stabilize itself. The root cause of the disaster traced back to a repair made 7 years earlier, after the plane had suffered a tail strike upon landing. The bulkhead had been improperly repaired by using a single row of rivets instead of the required double row. This flawed fix created a weak point in the structure. For years, it silently endured the stress of repeated pressurization cycles until that fateful evening when it finally gave way. With the aircraft severely crippled, the flight crew, led by Captain Masami Takahama, faced an almost impossible situation. Deprived of traditional flight controls, they attempted to steer using nothing but engine thrust, powering up one side to turn and easing off the other to adjust direction. This technique, known as differential thrust control, is extraordinarily difficult and rarely practiced outside of simulators. But somehow, they managed to keep the aircraft flying, barely, for another 32 minutes. Their efforts were nothing short of heroic, showcasing remarkable skill, discipline, and composure under unimaginable pressure. During those 32 minutes, the aircraft flew in wild, looping patterns over the mountainous terrain of central Japan. Air traffic control remained in contact with the crew, though the situation remained dire. Fighter jets were scrambled and caught glimpses of the struggling jumbo jet, but they were unable to assist. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. The plane was violently shaking, pitching and rolling unpredictably, and many passengers understood that the situation was desperate. Some began writing farewell letters to loved ones, scrawling notes on air sickness bags, tray tables, and whatever paper they could find. At 6:56 p.m., the aircraft could no longer sustain flight. It crashed into the rugged face of Mount Takamagahara in the Ueno area of Gunma Prefecture. The impact was catastrophic. Of the 524 people on board, only 4 survived, all women seated near the rear of the plane. Miraculously, one of them was a 12-year-old girl. Rescue operations were hampered by communication breakdowns and the challenging terrain. Tragically, the delay meant that several passengers who might have survived the crash succumbed to their injuries before help could arrive. The crash of Flight 123 remains the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history. It left an indelible mark on Japan and the global aviation community. Boeing eventually took responsibility for the flawed repair guidelines that contributed to the disaster. The tragedy prompted sweeping reforms in aircraft maintenance protocols, repair certification processes, and emergency response coordination. To this day, the crash is remembered not only for its massive loss of life, but for the extraordinary efforts of a flight crew who fought to the very end to save their passengers. It stands as a powerful reminder that in aviation, every detail matters, and that the smallest oversight can lead to the most devastating consequences. On the morning of August 31, 1988, passengers boarded Delta Airlines Flight 1141 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, expecting nothing more than a routine trip to Salt Lake City. The plane, a Boeing 727-200, had already flown in from Mississippi without incident. For many on board, this was just another hop across the country. But within minutes of takeoff, ordinary would collapse into chaos, leaving behind fire, twisted wreckage, and haunting questions that would change aviation forever. At the controls sat Captain Larry Davis, a seasoned pilot with more than 17,000 hours of flight time, alongside First Officer Kerry Kirkland and Flight Engineer Stephen Judd. Behind them, 4 experienced flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. Everything about the crew and the aircraft looked normal on paper, but in the cockpit, something was happening that passengers could not see. something that would prove fatal. As the engines hummed and the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the crew was not focused on checklists or the intricate demands of takeoff. Instead, their voices captured on the cockpit recorder reveal a chilling truth. They were talking about dating habits, politics, even joking about what they might say if they crashed. A sterile cockpit, required by law during critical phases of flight, simply didn't exist that morning. Discipline had broken down, and with it, the chain of safety meant to protect every soul on board. At 8:30 a.m., the 727 was cleared for takeoff. As the jet accelerated down the runway, nothing seemed amiss. Passengers felt the familiar surge of power, pressing them into their seats. Wheels left the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed like a normal climb. Then, the aircraft lurched violently. The right wing dropped. The tail scraped the runway, and within seconds, the plane began rolling uncontrollably. In the cockpit, Davis pulled back hard, trying to will the jet into the sky. The engines surged, then coughed with compressor stalls as airflow broke down. Witnesses on the ground saw the 727 staggering just a few hundred feet above the runway, trailing fire as it clipped an antenna array. The right wing began to tear apart in midair. The jet slid sideways, struck the ground, and disintegrated into a fiery trail nearly half a mile long. Inside, passengers screamed as flames engulfed the rear of the cabin. Survivors later recalled that the impact itself wasn't what killed most people. It was the fire and smoke. Some managed to fight their way to exits and escape across the burning wreckage. Others, overcome by smoke, never made it out. One man, having escaped the flames, turned back desperately to save his wife and others still trapped inside. He was pulled from the wreckage alive but burned so badly that he died days later in the hospital. When the smoke cleared, 14 people were dead, 2 flight attendants and 12 passengers. Dozens more were badly injured, including the captain and first officer who survived but carried the scars of their mistakes. The investigation revealed the most devastating truth of all. The crash was entirely preventable. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was caused by 2 failures: the crew's lack of discipline, which led them to skip critical steps, and the malfunction of the takeoff warning system, which should have sounded the alarm. But the finger of blame pointed even higher. Investigators found that Delta's culture allowed sloppy cockpit management, and the FAA had failed to crack down, despite knowing about long-standing issues with discipline among crews. The tragedy of Flight 1141 did more than take lives. The embarrassment of hearing pilots joking on cockpit recordings just before disaster struck shook the entire aviation industry. When the tapes were played on television, the outrage was so severe that laws were changed. Never again would raw cockpit voice recordings be released to the public, only written transcripts. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, heading for Beijing on what was supposed to be a routine red-eye flight. It was a quiet night with 239 people on board, passengers and crew settling in for the journey ahead. The plane, a Boeing 777, was one of the most reliable aircraft in the skies. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then, about 38 minutes after takeoff, the flight simply disappeared. At first, air traffic control lost contact. Not entirely unusual. Sometimes communications dip, but this wasn't just a blip. The plane's transponder, which communicates with radar systems, had gone dark. One moment it was there. The next, it was off the grid. As authorities scrambled, it was discovered that the aircraft had made a sharp left turn, doubling back over the Malaysian peninsula. From there, it veered off its flight path entirely, heading southwest into the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. What followed was one of the largest and most expensive search efforts in aviation history. Multiple countries joined the hunt. Ships, planes, satellites, all combed through thousands of square miles of ocean. But despite all the tech and teamwork, MH370 seemed to have vanished without a trace. For weeks, then months, the world waited. Families clung to hope. Investigators chased every lead, and theories began to swirl. Some debris eventually washed up, parts of a wing, some internal components found on remote beaches in places like Reunion Island and the coast of Africa. These fragments confirmed one thing: MH370 had crashed. But where exactly and why remained maddeningly unclear. Satellite data suggested the plane had flown for hours after contact was lost, deep into the Indian Ocean, far from any radar or rescue. With no black box, no clear wreckage, and no final communication from the cockpit, the theories came fast. Was it a hijacking? A mechanical failure? A deliberate act? Everyone from aviation experts to conspiracy theorists weighed in. The Malaysian government and international investigators released reports, but no theory could be proven beyond doubt. The mystery stayed locked beneath the waves. To this day, the disappearance of MH370 is one of aviation's greatest enigmas. It sparked worldwide debate on aircraft tracking, leading to changes in how planes are monitored over oceans. But it also left behind heartbreak for the families who never got closure and for the public still wondering how a massive commercial aircraft could simply vanish in the 21st century. It's a haunting reminder that even with all our modern technology, the world can still keep its secrets. And somewhere, deep in the ocean's silence, MH370 waits, its story still unfinished. On the evening of August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 left Tokyo bound for Osaka. There were 524 people on board. Among them were celebrities, parents with children, even the beloved singer Kyu Sakamoto, whose voice had once brought Japan joy with Sukiyaki. No one could have imagined that within an hour, the aircraft would be reduced to twisted metal in the mountains, with only 4 souls surviving. Just 12 minutes after takeoff, cruising above Sagami Bay, the plane shook violently. A deafening explosion tore through the cabin. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The rear of the plane had literally blown apart, an explosive decompression that ripped off the vertical stabilizer and severed all 4 hydraulic systems. Without hydraulics, the 747 was essentially a drifting coffin. The pilots, Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, were suddenly fighting the impossible. They yanked at the controls, barked orders, begged the plane to respond, but nothing happened. Their voices, captured forever on the cockpit voice recorder, shifted from calm professionalism to rising desperation. At one point, Takahama muttered words that still chill investigators to this day. "This may be hopeless." For 32 minutes, the aircraft staggered through the skies of Japan, its massive body lurching up and down in phugoid oscillations. From the ground, horrified witnesses looked up to see a Boeing 7TRY-7 rolling and dipping unnaturally, banking at terrifying angles, its tail missing. Inside, passengers clutched loved ones, prayed, and screamed as the plane rose and fell thousands of feet at a time. Some wrote farewell notes to their families on scraps of paper, knowing the end was coming. And still, the pilots fought, desperately trying to use engine thrust to steer the crippled jet, refusing to give up until the very last second. Tokyo air traffic controllers pleaded with the crew to turn back, to head for Haneda or divert to Nagoya, but the 747 barely responded, rolling left and right as if mocking every command. Oxygen masks at the rear had already stopped working. The pilots themselves ignored their own flight engineers' repeated calls to wear their masks, likely disoriented by hypoxia as precious seconds slipped away. Yet, even in this haze, they tried every desperate trick they could imagine, extending the landing gear, manipulating the flaps, begging the engines to give them some measure of control. But the giant machine was simply too broken. At 6:56 p.m., with the ground proximity warning system screaming in the cockpit, the crippled jet clipped a ridge near Mount Takamagahara. The right wing was torn apart. The aircraft rolled, flipped, and then slammed into another ridge. The explosion lit up the forest, and in an instant, 520 lives were gone. The investigation revealed something even more haunting. This catastrophe was not an act of fate, but of human error years in the making. 7 years earlier, the same plane had suffered a tail strike during a landing in Osaka. Boeing technicians had repaired the damage, but incorrectly. Instead of reinforcing the pressure bulkhead with a single continuous plate, they had used two smaller plates. This mistake weakened the structure, leaving it vulnerable to fatigue. Every pressurization cycle since then had been ticking time bomb. On Flight 123, it finally gave way. When the truth came out, the horror deepened. The crash was not only the deadliest single aircraft disaster in history, it was also one that could have been prevented. On March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 was on its way from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. It seemed like any other routine flight, with passengers relaxing in their seats and the crew going through their usual pre-flight procedures. But the tragic events that followed would forever change the airline industry. The plane, an Airbus A320, was carrying 150 people when it suddenly crashed into the French Alps. The cause? A deliberate act by the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz. Here's where things take a chilling turn. When the captain briefly left the cockpit, Lubitz locked him out. The cockpit door was reinforced, making it impossible for the captain to regain access. Inside, Lubitz made a devastating decision. Rather than follow standard procedure, he intentionally set the autopilot to descend rapidly, sending the plane toward the mountains below. The cockpit voice recorder captured the captain's desperate attempts to re-enter, but Lubitz remained silent, and the plane continued its terrifying descent. The sound of the captain's frantic efforts to break the door open was captured on the recording, along with the unmistakable noise of the plane's fatal plunge. It was an unimaginable turn of events that no one could have predicted. What made this situation even more shocking was that Lubitz had a history of mental health issues, including depression, which he had kept hidden from his employer. Investigators later found that he had sought treatment for these issues and had even been deemed unfit to fly on some occasions, but he had continued to work as a pilot. It became clear that he had been struggling privately with these issues, and tragically that led to this fatal decision. Lubitz's actions raised uncomfortable questions about the role of mental health in aviation safety, particularly the extent to which employers are responsible for ensuring that their employees are fit to fly. The Germanwings crash sent shockwaves throughout the aviation community, leaving everyone from industry experts to the public grappling with the implications of such a senseless act. In the aftermath of the crash, the aviation world was shaken to its core. The incident prompted immediate changes in airline policies, most notably the implementation of the two-person rule. This new rule mandates that at least two crew members must be present in the cockpit at all times, whether it's the captain and co-pilot or the co-pilot and a flight attendant. The hope was that this would prevent something like this from ever happening again, ensuring that no one could be left alone in the cockpit with the ability to make such a tragic decision. The Germanwings crash left a lasting mark on the aviation community and raised questions about mental health awareness, pilot screening, and the responsibility of employers to ensure their staff is fit for duty. The tragedy is a stark reminder of how important it is to address mental health issues, particularly in high-stakes professions like aviation, where the safety of others is in the hands of one person. The crash also highlighted the need for better systems of support for those dealing with mental health challenges, especially when those individuals hold jobs that could impact the lives of hundreds of people at a time. In the end, the crash claimed the lives of all 150 people on board, leaving families and loved ones devastated. While changes were made in the wake of the incident, it's a painful reminder that sometimes even the most routine of flights can take an unimaginable turn. The Germanwings tragedy remains one of the most heart-wrenching moments in aviation history, and its lessons continue to shape the industry to this day. On the morning of February 21, 1970, Swissair Flight 330 took off from Zurich Airport, bound for Tel Aviv, with Hong Kong as its final destination. On board the Convair CV999 Coronado named Baseland were 38 passengers and 9 crew members. It was supposed to be a routine journey. Instead, just 9 minutes after takeoff, horror struck. A bomb hidden deep within the aft cargo compartment exploded, ripping through the aircraft and filling the cockpit with thick, suffocating smoke. The pilots, blinded and struggling to breathe, fought to turn the plane back toward Zurich. Through the haze, they could barely read their instruments. Every second that passed meant less power, less visibility, and less hope. Air traffic control in Zurich tried desperately to guide the aircraft back. The voices captured on the cockpit radio tell a chilling story. Calm professionalism gave way to rising panic as the crew reported compression problems, then fire on board. Their words became fragmented, muffled, almost drowned out by chaos. "We have fire and smoke on board. I can't see anything," one of the pilots cried. Seconds later came their final, heartbreaking message. 330 is crashing. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. The jet veered west, powerless and off course, before slamming into a wooded area near Randlingen, Switzerland. All 47 souls on board were killed instantly. When investigators arrived, wreckage was scattered through the trees, even pieces of fabric hanging from branches like grim reminders of what had just unfolded in the skies above. Sabotage was suspected almost immediately. Just days before, 3 Palestinian militants had been sentenced in Switzerland, and revenge seemed the most likely motive. Reports at the time hinted at responsibility claimed by a Palestinian splinter group, though denials quickly followed. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. General Command was named in some accounts, though no one was ever convicted. The bomb itself was a cruel piece of engineering, a barometric-triggered device designed to detonate once the aircraft reached altitude. On that very same day, another bomb exploded aboard an Austrian Airlines Caravelle departing Frankfurt. That plane, unlike Swissair 330, managed to land safely. The cruel efficiency of coordinated terror left the world shaken. In the aftermath, questions piled up. Investigators produced a 165-page report pointing to Palestinian involvement. The Swiss public wondered why no one was ever held accountable. Some, like journalist Marcel Gier, would later claim that Switzerland had struck a secret deal with the PLO, looking the other way in exchange for a promise that no more attacks would target Swiss citizens. Officials denied it, yet suspicions linger to this day. The Tenerife airport disaster, which took place on March 27, 1977, remains the deadliest aviation accident in history, a title no one ever wants to hold. It happened at Los Rodeos Airport, now Tenerife North Airport, in the Canary Islands, when 2 massive Boeing 747s, one from KLM and the other from Pan American World Airways, tragically collided on the runway in dense fog, resulting in the loss of 583 lives. What makes this disaster even more haunting is that it wasn't caused by a mechanical failure or bad weather alone, but by a tragic sequence of miscommunication, assumptions, and bad timing that spiraled into the worst-case scenario. At the time, Los Rodeos was never meant to be hosting such a crowd. A terrorist bombing at nearby Gran Canaria Airport had forced dozens of incoming flights to divert to this much smaller, fog-prone airfield. As a result, the runway and taxiways were congested with parked planes and stressed crews, all waiting for clearance to depart. The weather then decided to make things even more complicated by rolling in thick fog, limiting visibility to just a few hundred feet. It was under these already tense and confusing conditions that the KLM and Pan Am flights began preparing for takeoff. Both aircraft were on the same runway. KLM had lined up, waiting to take off, while Pan Am was taxiing ahead, trying to find the right exit. Due to the poor visibility, the crews couldn't see each other, and neither could the control tower. That's where communication became absolutely critical, and unfortunately, where it also began to unravel. The KLM captain, a highly experienced pilot, misunderstood a transmission from air traffic control as a takeoff clearance. Confident he had permission to depart, he powered up the engines and began his takeoff roll. Meanwhile, the Pan Am plane was still taxiing slowly ahead on the same runway, unaware of the impending danger behind them. The result was catastrophic. By the time the Pan Am crew spotted the KLM jet barreling toward them through the fog, there was no time to react. The 2 aircraft collided at high speed, tearing through each other and igniting a massive fireball. The KLM plane became airborne for just a moment, before crashing back down, while the Pan Am jet was torn apart. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the fire and wreckage made rescue efforts incredibly difficult. Only 61 people survived, all from the Pan Am flight. Everyone aboard the KLM aircraft was killed. In the aftermath, investigators were determined to figure out how such a terrible miscommunication could occur. It became clear that a combination of ambiguous radio messages, assumptions by the flight crew, and the lack of visual confirmation led to the disaster. One major issue was the use of non-standard language between pilots and air traffic control. Phrases like, "We are at takeoff," were misinterpreted, and important confirmations weren't repeated or clarified. The aviation industry responded swiftly. One of the most significant outcomes was the global adoption of standard phraseology, a set of clear, concise, and universally understood phrases used in all aviation communication. Pilots and controllers were trained to use precise language, always confirming and repeating instructions. Additionally, the importance of crew resource management, CRM, gained attention, emphasizing teamwork, communication, and assertiveness within the cockpit, regardless of hierarchy. While the Tenerife disaster remains a deeply painful chapter in aviation history, it also became a catalyst for sweeping changes in airline operations and safety culture. The lessons learned have saved countless lives since. Today, commercial aviation is safer than ever, and much of that progress can be traced back to the hard lessons learned on that foggy runway in Tenerife. On a freezing January afternoon in 1982, Washington, D.C., the Potomac River below the 14th Street Bridge was coated in jagged sheets of ice. For most people, it was just another miserable winter day. But for the 79 people boarding Air Florida Flight 90, it would become a nightmare that the world would never forget. The flight, a Boeing 737 bound for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa, was delayed nearly 2 hours. What the passengers didn't know was that the storm wasn't their greatest enemy. The real danger came from inside the cockpit. Captain Larry Wheaton, 34, sat at the controls, with First Officer Roger Pettit, 31, beside him. Both were experienced pilots, but neither had much real-world experience flying in icy conditions like the ones that gripped Washington National Airport that day. They had watched other planes struggle, engines roaring against the frozen ground, wings icing over faster than crews could keep them clear. And yet, despite the clear risks, Flight 90 pushed forward. The plane had already faced problems just leaving the gate. Ice made it impossible for the tug vehicle to push the aircraft back, so the crew tried something desperate, using reverse thrust to free themselves. That decision was against Boeing's recommendations, but it revealed something even more alarming. The crew wasn't following safe winter protocols. They hadn't even switched on the engine anti-ice systems, a safeguard designed specifically for days like this. As the aircraft inched toward the runway, passengers peered out at the snow swirling in the wind. They could see ice clinging stubbornly to the wings, but the crew didn't return for a second round of de-icing. Instead, they tried another risky move, taxiing close behind a DC-9 in hopes its engine heat would melt the snow. What actually happened was far worse. The jet blast melted the snow, which then refroze as an icy layer across the wings and engine inlets. Finally, just before 4 p.m., the plane roared down the runway. Inside the cockpit, Pettit couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The instruments told them they had enough thrust, but the sound and feel of the engines told a different story. "God, look at that thing," Pettit said nervously. "That don't seem right, does it?" Captain Wheaton brushed him off. Seconds later, the plane lifted clumsily into the air, climbing no higher than a few hundred feet before the stall. Warning blared. The stick shaker rattled violently. "Stalling! We're falling!" Wheaton cried. "Larry, we're going down!" Pettit shouted. "I know," the captain yelled back. Those were his last words. At 4:01 p.m., in less than half a minute of flight, Air Florida Flight 90 slammed into the 14th Street Bridge, crushing cars and trucks caught in the evening traffic. Steel railings twisted like paper, 7 vehicles destroyed, 4 motorists killed instantly. Then with a deafening roar, the plane plunged straight into the frozen Potomac. In seconds, 78 people were dead or trapped. Only the broken tail remained above the icy water, where a handful of survivors clung desperately. The temperature was just 34 degrees, the river clogged with ice. They had minutes before hypothermia would take them. The crash site was chaos. Traffic jams blocked ambulances from getting through. Rescuers stood helpless on the shore, throwing ropes that fell short while survivors screamed in agony, their bodies slick with jet fuel. When the last survivor was pulled to shore, the silence was deafening. The wreckage of Flight 90 sank slowly beneath the ice, vanishing into the black water as if it had never existed.